and thank you so much everyone for coming. I really appreciate everyone making the last minute pivot as we've done many times before. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss some of the ideas in my book, Bound by Creativity, which was published in June by the University of Chicago Press. And I'm going to share my screen now, so you should be all able to see this. Oops, sorry, one moment here, just while I share the screen with you. Here we go. Okay, great. So you should all be able to see this now. And as I said, or as Katie said, Bound by Creativity is currently available from the bookstore. So please shop local and support the bookstore. And this is the cover of Bound by Creativity with art by B. Wirtz, who you'll meet a bit later in my talk. So I'm going to start this talk by reading an excerpt from the book, and I'll use this excerpt as a jumping off point to discuss the book more broadly, and then I'll go into a broader discussion of the book from here. So I'm going to start with a brief excerpt. In the 1990s, contemporary artist Lucky de Bellevue began experimenting with pipe cleaners, weaving the fuzzy wires into globular floor sculptures in intricate webs crawling up the sides of gallery walls. Lucky's pipe cleaner sculptures were widely exhibited in galleries and museums. He had a solo exhibition of the works in the atrium of the Whitney Museum of American Art, with a golden cobweb of pipe cleaners unfurling across the tall ceiling and spires rising from the marble floors. The exhibition's catalog hailed the installation as magical, describing a beguiling synthesis of kitsch and high art. Suddenly, Lucky stopped. Years later, sitting in his studio, Lucky explained to me that after a decade of producing pipe cleaner sculptures, he could not think of any more variations of this visual element. He said, "I remember I still have one piece that I kept trying to finish, and it just wasn't ending anymore. I kept doing things to it, and it just wasn't exciting to me." "Why do you think that boredom set in?" I asked. Lucky replied, "I'd already done so many permutations," sorry if you can hear these sirens in the back, "and so many formal ideas and referencing things enough to where I just reached the end of it." You're getting some authentic Brooklyn sounds here. After making many variations of these sculptures, such as interlacing colored pipe cleaners together to create the painterly impression of blending pigments and weaving feathers between the pipe cleaners, the idea of further pipe cleaner sculptures filled him with boredom rather than excitement. Over the next 15 years, Lucky experimented with printmaking and other media, pressing painted abstract shapes onto linen canvases, pasting rows of pistachio shells on canvases, and making canvases out of reusable shopping bags. He judged the abstract shapes to be closely aligned with his distinctive identity as an artist. I would cut out shapes that I was interested in, and I kept making those and making those and making those, 100 or so, and I realized that at some point I thought, these really are my shapes. This is really my vocabulary, kind of like my fingerprint. Lucky described the new works as conceptually consistent with his pipe cleaner sculptures. He viewed the media to be everyday rather than high art materials, and he saw the works as displaying his commitment towards the DIY, do-it-yourself movement and the democratizing potential of art. However, to others, the pipe cleaner sculptures and the pistachio shell canvases looked like they could be the works of two different artists. Curators, dealers, and collectors wanted to exhibit and collect only his pipe cleaner sculptures. Lucky described this period in his career as excruciating, and he questioned whether to continue working as an artist. And here you can see pictures of both the pipe cleaner sculptures and the pistachio shell canvases. Finally, in 2014, Lucky had a studio visit that did not end in polite rejection. Mark Beckman, an art dealer opening a new gallery on the Lower East Side, offered to represent Lucky and show Lucky's new work in the gallery's first solo exhibition. Lucky provided Mark with the legitimacy of a prestigious exhibition history, and Mark afforded Lucky visibility. The exhibition was not a home run, as the works went unsold for most of the exhibition, but it sparked attention. The New York Times gave the show a positive review in the final weeks of the exhibition. Mark had been present to discuss the exhibition when the critic visited the gallery, and the critics similarly discussed the elevation of everyday materials into art as a core consistency in Lucky's work. The review attracted some sales to prominent collectors, and both Mark and Lucky were satisfied. Mark contrasted the review in one written by Ken Johnson in the New York Times in 2000. In the gallery's back room, he unearthed the article from a pile on his desk and stabbed his index finger at it, describing the review as, quote, infamous and harmful to Lucky's career. People say they are against branding, and then they say stuff like this, he said. The review stated, Mr. de Bellevue may understandably want to avoid typecasting as, quote, the pipe cleaner guy. But these works have it all: formal rigor, inventive and intensive craft, goofy humor, and poetic imagination. You wonder why, for now at least, he bothers doing anything else. Most readers would likely see this review as positive, but Mark perceived the review as portraying the aesthetic value of Lucky's work in overly narrow terms that excluded newer works like the pistachio shell canvases. It's unclear whether those who knew Lucky's work remembered that specific review so many years later. What is certain is that collectors continued to strongly associate Lucky's work with his pipe cleaners. A year after the initial studio visit, Mark exhibited Lucky's work at a prominent art fair that showcased the work of emerging artists in New York, and Mark offered to let me observe in his booth. And here you can see on the left side here, we're setting up the booth, and then on the right side here, you see a collector once the booth is already set up looking at it. As I helped Mark and Lucky assemble the booth before the fair's VIP opening, during which invited collectors, curators, and reporters tour the booths, Mark discussed the talking points with me. Mark explained that because mid-career artists over the age of 40 who have achieved stable careers but not stardom, were often seen as, quote, over the hill by collectors, he wanted to describe Lucky, who was in his 50s, as a young artist. He reasoned, you can say he's young even if he's in his 50s because he has been off the market for over 10 years. I asked, what should I say if they asked about the pipe cleaners? Mark replied that I should not mention it, but if the collectors asked, that I should highlight the, quote, umbrella themes throughout the work. Lucky was dignifying non-traditional art making. His work was associated with the DIY movement. He embraced accidents in the creative process, and his work played on humor. The topic quickly proved impossible to avoid. For the next 9 hours, collectors meandered into the booth exclaiming in surprise, I remember when he was doing pipe cleaners. Peter Hort, a prominent collector, asked me, this is Lucky? I have his pipe cleaners. Mark explained that Lucky was experiencing his, quote, second life as an artist, and he reiterated the conceptual linkages between the pipe cleaner sculptures and the newer works. Toward the end of the fair, Mark was chain smoking outside the back door of the auditorium. Renting the booth alone for 4 days cost $9,000, and he was still waiting for a sale. The story of Lucky de Bellevue's work and career elicits many questions. Why would Lucky devote 15 years to producing pipe cleaner sculptures? And why would he believe that pipe cleaner sculptures and pistachio shells were part of the same language? Why would Mark exhibit Lucky's new work after a critic questioned why Lucky would, quote, bother doing anything else? Why were the pipe cleaner sculptures, but not the pistachio shell canvases, so vividly ingrained in collectors' minds? These questions hit upon the core nature of art. So this is how I start the book. And I think in the rest of our talk and the rest of the book, I unfold these questions. So I'll continue now. And in the contemporary art world, this was really a fascinating place to me because there's very little consensus in this field of contemporary art about what counts as good art. This is a field where anything goes. It's not necessarily about making something beautiful or even something that requires technical skill, but instead about capturing an idea with a form. So we're not judging what counts as aesthetically pleasing, but what kind of form captures an abstract theory or emotion or theme. And we don't widely agree about when forms capture these ideas in an original or compelling way. So these are some photos here of my ethnography. And as you can see here, a work of art could be a pile of rubble, or it can be a clothesline of socks. And these works can sell and do sell for thousands, tens of thousands, or sometimes millions of dollars in the contemporary art market. So as I studied the contemporary art world, I became really interested in how artists make these aesthetic judgments during the creative process in the absence of clear criteria for what makes art good or bad. While we can think of creativity more broadly, when we ask this question, what is creativity? When we're talking about creativity in cultural fields like art or music or literature, we're usually talking about what artists do to make creative products. So when I ask what is creativity in the contemporary art world, I'm asking how do artists make decisions during the creative process? So how do artists like Lucky decide to use pipe cleaners and how to use them and make these moment-to-moment decisions? In this process, artists are making aesthetic judgments that ultimately result in creative products. And by aesthetic judgments, I mean judgments about what constitutes a good work of art. So these are some pictures from my research, and I conducted my research in New York City, which is the epicenter of the New York or of the contemporary art market. And I did this research from 2014 to 2016, and then I did another year of research in 2018. This involved conducting ethnographic field work, which means I observed and participated in a variety of settings in the art world, and I interviewed also 100 artists, dealers, curators, collectors, and art advisors for this research. And because I'm discussing specific works of art, I use most people's real names in the book with their permission. So these photos here show the process of installing an exhibition, socializing in artist studios, going to art fairs and parties with collectors. And here you can see this picture on the bottom right. This might look like a museum, but this is the home of a private collector in Manhattan. This was a 6-story home. The contemporary art world is a center of elite culture. Most works are priced in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of dollars. Collectors usually own thousands of works at these price points. And in fact, they only consider themselves collectors once they have a storage unit for their art. So as you can probably tell from these photos on the left compared to these photos on the right, the photos on the left involve artists, and the photos on the right are scenes involving collectors. These are really different social scenes. And it was really interesting to me as an ethnographer to traverse these social spaces and also watch them collide as artists interact with collectors and other people in the art world. So these worlds are really interacting with each other. Artists are going to fairs and parties with collectors, and collectors are also going into artist studios. So I interviewed artists in their studios, and often I'd return to the studio every few months to see how their work had changed. So the studios are usually messy and hectic spaces. As you can see in the photo on the bottom right, this particular artist has chickens in his studio. Sometimes there's studio assistants, but usually artists are there making their work alone. And studios are usually packed with art in different stages of progress, including source materials, sketches and models, unfinished work, as well as abandoned work and finished work. And so this also allowed me to see how artists made decisions at different phases of the creative process. So I'm first going to show how people in the art world discuss what creativity is. And I'll highlight this idea of having a creative vision. These narratives of creativity are important because they influence how artists experiment in their studios. Moving into the studio, I'll then show how artists use a process of experimentation that results in what they view as a creative vision. And I'll show how the structure of the creative process itself ultimately reinforces certain ways of judging creativity. And then finally, I'll show how, as artists' work circulates through the art world over time, these orientations to judging creativity, these ways of judging creativity, and these perceptions of particular artists' creative visions can ultimately constrain what artists can produce. So taken together, I'll show how artists don't just experiment with infinite possibilities, even though in theory anything goes, but instead they form a set of parameters that they develop over time through the process of experimentation. And these parameters are informed also by their interactions in the art world. So ultimately, creativity is bound by the idea of creativity itself and the structure of the creative process. So let's jump into the art world now. So I'll start by looking at how creativity is judged within the art world. And as I will show, people in the art world discuss good artists as those who have artistic autonomy, aesthetic commitment, and continued experimentation. And together they see these as the mark of a true creative vision. So the first quote here is from a dealer in a critically acclaimed gallery in Chinatown. And we're sitting in the back room of the gallery in the evening after the gallery has closed, and she's stuck at work while waiting for an artist who's currently missing their meeting. So she's not happy here, and she vents to me, quote, "They are fucking psycho, lazy, useless, undependable." Okay, so artists sometimes, it's probably not their fault that they are completely incapable of taking care of themselves. They are just in a permanent childlike state, and actually making art and having someone else sell it for them is the only way they could ever survive as people, because they would otherwise be homeless. And I guess they can kind of be visionary and inspiring in one way or another, but they are those kinds of really hopeless people. So in her narrative, we get this image of the artist, very pejorative image, as someone who is an incompetent person who can't deal with normal adult responsibilities, but also has the saving grace of being a, quote, visionary. And the next quote here is from another dealer in an established gallery talking about the role of dealers in relation to the artists that their gallery represents. And she says, "We are not co-producers of the artwork. So a good art dealer is not trying to influence the way something is going to be created, because you are just going to cloud that. If that artist is looking to their art dealer for advice on how to paint something, there is no place for them in this art world. They need to trust their own vision. So you can't be like, you know, I think that should be blue." So this dealer is saying that true artists have to follow their own vision, which can't be dictated by others. And I'll highlight a couple points here. So first, artists are seen to be incapable of dealing with non-creative aspects of their professional lives, such as financial decisions. And this had a real impact on artists' relationships with their dealers. For example, artists represented by dealers do not set their own prices and sometimes don't even know the prices of their own work. However, there's the supposed sphere of aesthetic autonomy surrounding the artist. Artists are supposed to be able to make their own creative decisions and be able to find their own way in the studio without having others tell them what to do. And dealers were expected to respect this. For example, even though dealers often know what's more marketable, they would often find indirect ways to tell artists this, and even sometimes show work that they did not think would sell in order to show that they were supporters of true creative visions. So there's a sphere of creative autonomy, and within this space, artists are supposed to produce a vision. What we see emerging is this idea that true artists have a creative vision, and that this is what makes their work important and original aesthetically. So supporting this concept of the creative vision is this idea that true artists have an enduring obsession with or commitment to certain aesthetic themes. So this collector and I visited a studio of an emerging artist in Queens together. And the artist had spent several years making sculptures of pink pillbox hats, meticulously positioned to mirror the trajectory of Jackie O's hat during JFK's assassination. And she did this by analyzing 7 seconds of film footage, frame by frame. So the collector here is wandering around the studio, and she says, "You are still not done." And the artist says, "No, every time I finish one, I have to make another. I probably have between 4 and 6 left in this section of film." And the collector says, "Oh God, I'm overwhelmed." And later in the studio visit, the collector says, "What galleries have come through? What about Tanya Banakdar? She would love this." And the artist says, "I would love an introduction. I haven't really sought out a gallery. I've just been working." The collector legitimizes this, saying, "As you should be." And the artist says, "I'm a bit of a cave dweller." And later, when we're in the taxi going back to the collector's home, she turns to me and says, "She's obsessed." So here we see both the artist and the collector emphasizing the artist's obsession with this theme. And we also see the artist downplaying professional savviness. Together, the artist and collector communicate their view that continuing to explore the same themes over time represents aesthetic obsession, and that this is the mark of a true creative vision. And collectors like doing studio visits with artists in part because they felt like getting to know the artist personally and seeing their studio space gave them further insight into artists' creative visions, because the artist's creative vision was supposed to be associated with the artist's identity as a person. So while consistency is seen as the mark of a true artist, artists are also expected not to take this too far. Here, I was walking around a major contemporary art fair with a collector and several of the collector's friends. And the collector stopped in one booth and said to his friends, "That's a John Pastoni. It has that look. It doesn't look like anyone else. I could tell right away just by glancing. He added cat litter to his paintings to give it a wonderful rough texture. It brought it up a notch. What makes a great artist? You progress. He struggles. If you talk to him, he's like, I don't know. And with any artist, not everything he makes is incredible, but he self-edits. So there's this consistency because you can tell it's a Pastone just by seeing the image, but he also highlights that the artist is willing to continue to experiment even to the point of floundering or failing. In this narrative, consistency is seen to be evidence of aesthetic commitment, and variation is seen to be evidence of a willingness to experiment. And in the art world, it was not enough to have either aesthetic commitment or a willingness to experiment. Instead, this was something that artists needed to balance and also manage this balance over time. So this brought me to this idea of the creative vision, and a creative vision, which in the art world is also sometimes called a signature style, is what people perceive as a bundle of recognizable and enduring elements within an artist's body of work. People believe that creative visions also evolve over time, so the creative vision embodies values of both aesthetic commitment and experimentation. And the value placed on the creative vision oriented people's aesthetic judgments. So for example, I saw collectors pass up new works by well-known artists whose work they already owned because they felt that the new series was either too much of a departure from the artist's previous work or that the artist's work hadn't changed enough. Narratives of creativity influenced how artists experimented in the studio and were reinforced also by how artists experimented. So I'm now going to bring us into the studio so we can see how these narratives of creativity were actually enacted in the creative process, how an artist creates a body of work that's seen to have a true creative vision. So here we're going to see how artists use certain processes of experimentation to create these, to make these creative visions that are deemed to have this balance of consistency and variation that we just discussed. And artists recognized that the creative process was highly uncertain. When they experimented with new elements, like a new material or technique, they could not quite imagine what result they were going to get. This uncertainty was a risk. They needed to produce work that would be judged as representing a unique creative vision, so they couldn't spend all of their time and money making work that others wouldn't want to buy. To manage this uncertainty, they used what I call low stakes experimentation. In other words, they tested out ideas efficiently by using fast processes of production and inexpensive materials. Some common examples of low stakes experiments are sketches and models. In this image, you can see artist Davina Samo's work, and these are these are works that compose of big pieces of leather, which she would pour hot cement over, and you can see these works on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, you can see leather test strips that she made to see how the leather would react to cement at different thicknesses. So she began by producing smaller squares, and first the test strips, then smaller squares, and then made larger squares. And she started repeating certain elements while varying other conditions. And as she did, she reduced uncertainty in various elements because she learned how to predict the leather to react to different techniques. So for example, she thought that this mottled effect, which you can see in the photo on the left-hand side here, she thought that this was due to the cement dyeing the leather. But when she varied the color of the leather, she realized that it was actually the hot cement burning the leather. So as she understood how different elements worked, she started incorporating multiple elements together into the same piece, such as hanging chains from the painting or even molding the cement around the chains. And this process of testing individual elements and then adding them together allowed for more formal complexity. So we can see here that artists allowed for heightened uncertainty during early stages of the process, such as when she's producing these test strips of leather. This is during low stakes experimentation. And then as they repeat that element over and over, they reduce uncertainty and develop what I call creative competencies, or more refined expectations of material results through this process of repeated testing. So as artists repeated certain elements across different works, they created consistencies within their body of work because they were repeating this element over and over. And these consistencies were really important to developing these creative competencies or better understandings of these material results. So artists' ideas about what was relevant to their creative vision guided these initial low-stakes experimentations. So this is a quote from artist B. Wertz, whose work you saw on the book cover. And B said, I felt I needed to limit the scope of what was available to me in terms of found objects because it was just too overwhelming. And it makes you have more freedom in a way because you have to be more inventive with what you do. If you limit it, then you have to think of other things to do. So B's work was composed around the themes of bare necessities, what he called eating, drinking, and staying warm. And his work involved mostly sculptures made of different mundane objects like clothing or kitchenware, and he'd incorporate these different objects with wood, metal, wire, and other materials. So he sort of limited the scope of what he would experiment with during this process of low stakes experimentation. And then as he experimented with these different media, he would repeat certain elements over and over. B's perception that these materials and themes were relevant to his creative vision arose through the process of experimentation, and then these channeled future low stakes experiments. So here B's describing this specific work, which involved this pink plastic toy. And B says here that sorry, I'm just going to go back here from 1 minute here. So putting parameters on the source material allowed him to do this low stakes experiments in an effective way because it made the possibilities not limitless. And so this is another reason why consistencies occurred during the creative process. So as he produced new work, he looked back on his body of work to identify further consistencies. And this was important in order to create a coherent narrative of his creative vision to himself or others. And so here he's talking about recognizing consistency in his work during the process of putting together a retrospective exhibit, which is a retrospective exhibit is a big solo exhibition that covers multiple previous series. So here he says, I hadn't seen so much of it over such a long period together like that ever before. I was really surprised at how weirdly consistent I had been. And that was interesting to me because I thought, this is really who I am, but it wasn't just repeating either. So here we see this, how artists started by experimenting with ideas that they thought might be relevant to their creative vision, like this idea of bare necessities or wire or wood. And the process of experimentation required them to repeat certain elements so that they could see how these elements would react to different materials and techniques. And then people like B looked back on their work. They had retrospective exhibits, making them reflect on their work, and they would recognize these patterns in their work, which just served to further their belief that these were really representing their true creative vision, and they would then become more committed to those elements and keep producing them in the future. But artists couldn't just keep producing the same elements over and over. As we saw, they also needed to introduce variation. Otherwise, people would see their creative vision as stagnant, and they would also become bored in the creative process. So here B's explaining to me how he made this particular work, which involved this pink plastic toy that his friend gave him. So B says, I started with this because someone gave me this thing. Some friend had it and he thought, oh, B would like that. And so he said, okay, oh, you can. And so he said, oh, you can have it. So he gave me that. And this is not something I would normally, well, okay, I use these kinds of hanging things, but not like a pink one. So this is a little different, a little weird. And I said, yeah, it's a little too plasticky, fabricated. And B said, yeah, kid-like. And so I thought, oh, that's an interesting challenge. What can I do with it? So I had this idea, okay, I think I'll hang wooden clothespins from it. And then I thought, now how am I going to display it? So it was going to be like a smaller thing with something holding it. And then I thought, well, I'll make this bigger structure, and then it needs more height. So here we can see him trying to expand his body of work by experimenting with new elements, incorporating these new elements that he might not normally use, like this pink plastic toy. So B builds this whole structure around the plastic toy in an effort to make it fit with his body of work. So you can see on the left-hand side here, the pink plastic toy is in the middle. This is the structure that he builds around it. But when I returned a few months later, the structure was still there, but the pink toy had been removed and replaced with a cloth napkin. And the napkin was related to the concept of domesticity, which was prevalent in his work. So this was a case where an artist tried, but ultimately did not use a new element because the artist couldn't experiment to a point where he felt that the work was both representative of his enduring commitment and also his desire for continued experimentation. So he ultimately felt like the work wasn't representing his creative vision until he replaced the toy with a cloth napkin here. A couple months later, when I visited B, he was working on this new piece, which he called Kitchen Trees. B was invited to do a public art sculpture for the Public Art Fund, which is a nonprofit in New York, and this work was ultimately displayed in City Hall Park in downtown Manhattan. The work had to be large scale and weatherproof, which created this challenge for B because he usually made small sculptures with everyday objects. So he had to figure out how to make it fit with his creative vision while also incorporating new elements. And ultimately, he made this work out of durable materials like colanders and plastic vegetables that he's still connected to themes that were still connected to themes of domesticity here. So as we can see, artists use processes of experimentation that allow them to produce and recognize consistencies that they associate with their creative visions, while also introducing new elements that they also associate with their creative visions. The creative vision becomes something that artists and others can recognize without being static as they continue to introduce these new elements. Artists' process of experimentation are influenced by these narratives of creativity, but narratives of creativity are also influenced by how artists and others perceive the creative process. So, for example, dealers are exposed to the creative process through their interactions with artists and studio visits. They see that different artists have different levels of creative output based on their techniques, and they also go through ebbs and flows in the creative process where they're producing more or less. And so these understandings of the creative process that dealers are exposed to shape how artists do their own work. So for example, dealers will have different artists exhibit works with different frequencies and have somewhat flexible exhibition schedules to accommodate the creative process. So here, these sort of narratives of creativity are coming from dealers' own exposure to the creative process. So while artists can, in theory, experiment with infinite elements, in practice, artists' actual creative processes are bound in different ways. As we've seen, artists are influenced by narratives of creativity that circulate in the art world. As artists experiment in their studios, they repeat certain elements and associate their work with these elements in a way that they come to see as parameters on the kind of work they make. So these practices of experimentation also bound or constrain the creative process, even if it's seen in a productive way. Finally, as works leave the studio, we'll now see how other people's perceptions of specific creative visions place further boundaries on how artists experiment. So I'll end by discussing the different ways that the creative process is bound by the social world. And I'll discuss this last point using the case of Catherine Bernhard, who you see here. Catherine first became known for her sloppily painted fashion models, which you can see here on the left-hand side, and these sold well and received positive reviews. After a couple of years, Catherine felt like she was finished with these works and began making collaborative works with her husband, consisting of collaging African textiles on canvas, which she referred to as rug paintings. And you can see one of these on the right-hand corner in the photo of Catherine and her son. Catherine described the difficulty in exhibiting and selling the rug paintings. She said, Canada said they wanted to show paintings only from me, not collaborative works. When they told me that, I was only making collages. So I was like, whatever, I am making collages. So I made them anyway, and we had a show at the Wohl, which is a lesser known gallery. After the collages, Canada was still like, we want a painting show, painting, painting, painting. So I was like, okay, and I came up with this. So Catherine showed me her new series, and these included paintings filled with cigarettes, lipstick, and juice boxes in the same sloppily painted style as her previous series of models, and she told me that this series sold out. Although Catherine initially sidestepped Canada's refusal of her new works by continuing to produce the rug collages, she ultimately returned to producing series in her more recognizable painting style and exhibiting them at Canada Gallery. A year later, I walked into Canada's booth at Frieze, one of New York's biggest fairs, and I asked the dealer the price of Bernhardt's 2 paintings of toilet paper, tacos, and Pac-Man, one of which is pictured here on the far wall, as well as the price of her 3 rug collages, one of which is pictured here on the near wall. I can see the sirens going, so I'm just going to give this a minute to pass. Okay. He replied that the paintings cost $25,000 and $30,000 each, but that the rug collages were only $6,000 each. Why the price discrepancy, I asked? They are about the same size. Well, she's really more noted for these kinds of paintings, he explained. So here we see that when artists become known for a certain kind of work, this is the work that is most in demand and priced the highest. And this is because collectors value the artist for what they believe is original about the work, which they view as represented by the creative vision. As we saw from looking at the creative process, developing creative competencies in order to make a new series, sorry about this, takes a lot of time and effort, and artists can risk being judged as not committed enough to a new idea for it to be considered a core part of their creative vision. So artists who become, quote, noted for certain elements can face challenges when they try to introduce new elements, even if, in theory, dealers and collectors think that they should be free to experiment. So I started with this question of how artists make creative visions without a consensus in the field about what is good art. And artists deal with this by sidestepping objectivity when it comes to aesthetic judgment. They really sidestep this question of, is art good or bad? Instead, they judge artwork in terms of its relevance to their distinctive creative visions. So in the art world, this idea of having a creative vision, which is demonstrated by aesthetic autonomy and a balance of consistency and variation, is important. And artists' perceptions of their specific creative visions arise through the process of experimentation. And through these moment-to-moment decisions, artists develop understandings of that they have a certain group of consistencies, which together they recognize as their creative vision. So artists' distinctive creative visions arise through this ongoing creative process through which artists experiment and identify with certain core and enduring elements. And the second point I want to make is that, as we've seen, creativity is bound by these ideas of creativity itself. These parameters artists set these parameters that artists set themselves during the creative process, and audiences own perceptions of each artist's creative vision. So we'll look at this, we'll return to our pipe cleaner guy once more, where we can see these different boundaries at work. So Lucky believed that he should make work that was consistent with core elements in his creative vision, while also continuing to experiment with new media, techniques, and themes. So this is how this idea of creativity and specifically this idea of the creative vision sort of channeled how he thought about his work in the studio. And he developed understandings of what was consistent with his creative vision through the process of experimenting in the studio. So Lucky made different variations of pipe cleaner sculptures to understand how new materials would react in the creative process. And as he made more and more of these works, he increasingly identified them with his creative vision. But as he reduced uncertainty by repeating this process over and over, he eventually became bored, which led him to search for new materials and techniques like the pistachio shells that he would still make fit within the parameters of his creative vision. So here we see how artists themselves set parameters for what they're going to experiment with, and these parameters arise through the creative process itself. But unfortunately, not everyone's understanding of Lucky's creative vision included pistachio shells. Collectors valued Lucky's work for what they believed was most distinctive and original about it. They valued him for being the, quote, pipe cleaner guy. So Lucky struggled with a loss of exhibition opportunities and sales when he made works that others did not see as a core part of his creative vision. And this is how audiences' perceptions of each artist's creative vision can ultimately constrain what artists can produce. So while a lack of consensus over good art is, while there's this lack of consensus over what constitutes good art in the contemporary art world. While in theory, art can be anything, in practice, this is not the case. In practice, artists' aesthetic judgments are oriented by their understandings of their creative visions, their specific creative visions, which evolve through the creative process and are also shaped by how other people are responding to their work as their work circulates through the social world. Okay, so I'm going to stop now and I'm going to stop my screen share so we can go back to our main room, and I would be happy to answer any questions now. And you're welcome to put questions in the chat. You can also use the hand raising function. I think I see Linda's hand up. Yes.
Well, you know that I'm a studio jeweler and therefore a craft artist. And so my major question is kind of tangential to what you were talking about, is why you chose not to investigate craft artists as well as the other artists that you worked with.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's definitely some really good sociology books out there on the craft art movement. So I would be happy to shoot you an email with some references if you're more interested in that. But ultimately, it was just a matter of, as an ethnographer, you know, trying to capture a social scene. I felt like there's only so much I could really do well. And I was really trying to capture not, when I say the contemporary art world, I don't mean every art that a living artist is making, because there's many kinds of art worlds out there. And so when I refer to the contemporary art world, I'm really talking about this art world in which artists are making work that is supposed to embody a particular theory or concept or idea or emotion, rather than sometimes more representative work or craft work, which is really circulated in totally different worlds. So like they are sold in different types of galleries or spaces like Etsy, where the contemporary art world really wouldn't have, has very little overlap with that. So it's sort of like the same reason I didn't write on literature, right? It's like I was trying to capture one social world, and there's only so much you can do well in a book. So I wanted to make sure I was really representing this world well. And I think, you know, my research wouldn't be necessarily generalizable to all other art worlds, right? So some like this idea of having a creative vision, I think, is somewhat important in the craft world, but maybe not quite as salient. And so, you know, and the way that the work is circulated happens very differently. And so, so I was really bounding it to what I could generalize to.
Would you consider approaching the craft world in the future in terms of your research?
Yeah, definitely. And I have studied other art worlds in the past. So my first ethnography that I did earlier on in my career was actually on figure drawing. And that was an entirely different art world, where they were actually really opposed to the contemporary art world and really strongly defined themselves as not a part of that world and didn't want to be associated with it at all. And so it was definitely really separate, but I'm more broadly an ethnographer of creative industries. So I've done work on literature, I've done work on technology. And so definitely it's something I might do in the future.
Okay, that's an invitation then.
Yes, thank you. Let me see, I'm just catching up with the chat here. Barbara's asking, is there an example of an artist who successfully transitioned from one aspect of her vision to another, overcoming adverse reactions from collectors / the market? So yeah, and that was something that I didn't have as much time to talk about here, but the way that artists responded to this idea of the creative vision in terms of their ability to sell their work really differed depending on their career stage. So for example, emerging artists were trying to make their mark on the art world. They were not yet widely known, so they didn't have to yet contend with these perceptions, these widely held perceptions of their creative visions, because no one really knew what their creative visions were. So they were mostly trying to do this one really distinctive thing that people would notice. Whereas established artists, especially those who were established for a narrow formal consistency, like pipe cleaners, where that's a really unusual medium. They had to sort of overcome that more. They had to say, you know, no, I'm not just the pipe cleaner guy, I also do this, and try to be seen for that. The people I saw that were more successful in doing this were people who had primarily identified their creative visions around like these very broad conceptual consistencies versus narrow formal consistencies from earlier on in their career, and had continued with multiple different kinds of formal work. But that was really challenging, because even people that tried to do that couldn't help but become more known for certain series than others. And also, I think artists had a better time of this when they were more critically oriented. So they were represented by more critically oriented galleries versus commercially oriented galleries. But these artists tend to, they could sometimes sustain a career, but they weren't making, you know, they weren't becoming as known. You know, they were sort of like quote unquote artists. They weren't becoming as known in the wider art world. And they also really weren't quite as commercially successful, although they could sustain these careers, and I think often found their careers more fulfilling. So that's a great question, but often it was this trade-off that they were very conscious of, and they did various things to try to mitigate this. So sometimes artists would take well-known works off their websites, for example, to try to sort of downplay these works that they had actually become the most known for. Let's see, did you find any consistency across artists in how they approached this artistic scene? Or the art world. Could you, yeah, maybe you could say more about this. I don't know, let's see, this is, I can't see first names here, H.S. Whetstone. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that more so I can make sure I'm understanding your question.
Well, I was wondering, when someone wants to do this kind of conceptual art, if there's a pathway that is suggested. Certainly you have to have a vision, and you have to have a way of putting out your ideas. But how do you get into this world?
So one way, I mean, practically speaking, one way is MFA programs. And so in MFA programs really proliferated over the last 30 or 40 years, where they were really almost non-existent in the 70s, and then became more and more popular to the point where they were almost like compulsory for making it in the contemporary art world, because this is where you developed not only a theory of your work, but also a social network. And so artists go through these MFA programs, and they're problematic in various ways. So for example, these programs might be $60,000 a year for 2 years in these programs. And unlike going to business school, you don't have this clear sort of money-making career path when you come out. So I think it precludes a lot of artists that are not coming from high-income families, or they get saddled with a lot of loans. So I think there's a lot of ambivalence about this in the art world for good reason. But most artists now do go through these MFA programs. They form an initial social network there, and then they try to connect with galleries. Often they start by doing other sort of contingent labor in the art world, such as being a gallery assistant or a studio assistant or an art handler. And this can help them make connections to higher status artists. They start by trying to get their work into groups shows, and then gradually solo shows. And then from there, they can sometimes be represented by a gallery. But a social network is really important. Let's see. So one person asked, how does Saul LeWitt central to MoCA? And I think you might mean, and I assume you're referring to Mass MoCA here. I've of course seen the Saul LeWitt there many times, fit into your paradigm. So yeah, maybe you can elaborate. Do you mind elaborating on that as well? Francine?
Just a second. I don't know how to elaborate other than to ask, was his process so long ago that it predates your putting together your theory? Or even though it was 30, 40, 50 years ago, do you see the changes in his interests fitting the question of how much can I change and how much must I be the same?
Yeah, and so I would say, you know, at some level, like superstar artists, once they reach a certain level of fame, they, you know, at some point they're maybe they're most known, so they at some level are most likely to sort of be like pigeonholed by audiences, but they're also more free economically, and they get to show they have more exhibition opportunities. So anything they make, including sort of lesser known series, will find a home. So in some sense, they have more both economic and artistic freedom once you get to that superstar level. But we're maybe talking, you know, like 20 artists at that level versus the thousands and thousands and thousands who are either emerging or pretty established, but not these household names. So I think that's like the level of fame is the only sense in which I think there's a difference there.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. So Keith asked, how does human nature play a part in turns in artists' careers, in the natures of collectors' preferences, and the finickiness of the art world? Let's see. So I think, you know, you can tell me if I'm responding to what you're asking or if you want to ask this in a different way. But in terms of artists' careers, you know, I think artists confronted the same issues often, but didn't always respond to them in the same ways. So, for example, when an artist felt like they were bored with their work, I met some artists who continued to make work in this sort of narrow formal consistency for many, many years. They were often seen as sellouts by other people, but they were often able to still sell it. And then I met other artists who also got to that point in their career where they got bored. And even though they felt like they could still sell the work, just felt like they couldn't do it anymore personally and started making something else, facing very serious losses. While they weren't seen as sellouts, and that was a benefit, they actually did lose exhibition opportunities and sales. And so maybe that's sort of, and you know, the artists that tended to change were more sort of connected to a more critical side of the art world versus the more commercial art world. So there was maybe some difference in social position, but you could also say perhaps, you know, there was some sort of deep personality difference, which sort of goes beyond the purview of sociologists, and it's hard to explain, but that could possibly be like quote unquote human nature there. In terms of collectors' preferences, so yeah, I didn't talk about collectors much in this talk, but I do have a whole chapter on collectors specifically, and I was really interested in them as well. Both because, you know, they create this demand that artists do on some level respond to, but also because it was just this sort of bizarre social world that I think is interesting to anyone. But collectors also, you know, one thing that surprised me was that collectors also define themselves as having, or describe themselves as having, a creative vision. And to them, you know, they had a creative vision because they had unique tastes and preferences, and they were putting together a collection of other people's work. So they had a body of work. It wasn't a body they had produced themselves, but it was a collection composed of many artists' work that they had hand selected and that they thought represented their unique identities in much the same way that artists felt like their work represented their unique identities. And so this definitely, you know, could reflect, you know, aspects of artists or collectors' personal backgrounds and upbringings, and you know, gender, perhaps, like if they were interested in work that discussed feminism, or there was many facets of identity that could be represented there, as well as things that maybe don't sort of neatly fit with identity, like an interest in works in grayscale or an interest in sculpture, things like that. So I think, but I did see collectors, following the same norms and rules socially. So, even this idea that they were having this creative vision, like that's sort of a social norm, even if it's bringing them to unique preferences. And I also saw collectors balancing buying work that was the iconic work of pretty established artists, because this helped their collection look valuable consistently to outsiders, while also collecting more emerging work or more idiosyncratic work by known artists to show the distinctiveness of their collection. So they were doing this sort of balancing act between sort of more known and legitimated works with more idiosyncratic works that would show their distinctiveness. Let's see, I think I've gotten to the end of the chat, but feel free to raise your hand, and you can use the hand raising function if you want, or you can try frantically waving at me. That should work as well. Yes, you can unmute yourself. Do you want to unmute yourself? You have to unmute yourself.
Oh, I am unmuted. I'm wondering where you're going next with this.
Oh, where am I going next? Sorry, I'll get to you in a second. Thank you. And I can't see your first name. It just says HS. So sorry if I'm responding to you as HS here. Where am I going next? I haven't really decided. I mean, I was actually poised to start a new research when the pandemic hit. So I've been collecting a bunch of different archival data sets and looking at those. And so I've been doing that, and I'll be moving to LA actually in January 2020 to sort of pilot several different projects, 2022, I mean, to pilot a couple of different projects. But I think my next project will not be about the contemporary art world, but will be an ethnography of another creative industry, probably based in LA. This is my dad for everyone.
It would seem that the artists and the collectors would come from very different worlds, but they have to kind of socialize together. And in fact, at an extreme level, a lot of people expect artists to be somewhat eccentric, whereas the collectors sort of are supposed to be normal, albeit wealthy people. How does that work? How does that relationship work?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple things there, and this was something that was really interesting to me to see how these really different worlds collided. So, first of all, the dealers liked that the artists were eccentric because they associated eccentricity with having a creative vision. Like the eccentric type was someone who is a really unique person, which also maybe spilled over into their unique creative vision. And they wanted to understand their eccentricity because then they could better understand their creative vision. And so, but there was this sort of power imbalance. So while artists were, when they were interacting with collectors going to these parties, this was always, at least in part, work for them. But collectors defined this as play and leisure for them. They were hanging out with their friends. They were getting to meet artists. It was like an educational experience. It was also a philanthropic experience for them. They were supporting artists. So they saw this as philanthropy, even though they were sometimes making money off of these works at the same time as they accrued value. And while they were spending a lot of money, this was disposable income for them. So it was more play and leisure. And it was interesting to me that, artists were really nervous often. They felt like their careers were riding on these interactions with collectors, which they were. And collectors were very unaware that artists were not having as much fun as they were during these interactions. The only collector that even mentioned this power dynamic was by far the most low status of the collectors that I interviewed. So it seemed like the more high status the collector, the less they were aware of this power imbalance, and that artists were not purely seeing this as leisure. So there was definitely a disconnect in how the two groups were experiencing the social interaction, but collectors wanted artists there because they got to better understand the creative vision, but also because it allowed them to sort of dip their toe in this fun bohemian lifestyle that made their socializing even more fun. Yeah, these have been really great questions. Thank you so much. And yeah, I think I have another one there. Do you want to unmute?
So I'm just curious, was there anything that really shocked you in all of this from, just in your work for the 2 years or whatever? Did you come across anything that really, you just kind of were really shocked about?
Yeah, I mean, so let's see, shock is like a strong word. I don't know if like, I mean, and I did have some exposure to the contemporary art world. So I'm trying to think of like, what was the most surprising to me. I think maybe on some sort of like voyeuristic level, I was not exposed to the level of wealth in the New York contemporary art world, especially among collectors. So I think, growing up in the Berkshires, it's an affluent community, but like the wealthiest people are maybe like orthodontists, right? So it's not the same level as when you go to New York and you go and real estate is extremely, extremely expensive in New York. And you realize that people own 6-story buildings where that's their entire home, or like some of these apartment buildings on Park Avenue that I've been in, like the whole floor is their one apartment. So I think, on maybe a less sort of theoretical level, but more empirical, just level, that was really sort of the most shocking thing, coming from a pretty small town and then going to a big city where wealth is just at an entirely different scale. And there was definitely a disconnect there. I did most of this research when I was in graduate school and had a graduate school stipend. And when I would go around to collect with collectors and I would say, oh, I really like that painting, they would say something like, oh, just grab it, not realizing that the painting was worth more than my salary for a year. And so those moments could be really jarring, I think, just experiencing the way that not the 1% lives, but like the 0.01% lives was kind of shocking, I would say. Yeah, thank you so much. Let's see, let me just open the chat. Oh, how does the psychology of creativity differ from the sociological study of creativity? Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There is this whole psychology of creativity, like Csikszentmihalyi is one author that's written Flow and has this whole psychology of creativity, but I think, the methods tend to differ a lot. So psychologists often use experimental level methods in labs, whereas sociologists look at use either qualitative methods like interviewing or ethnography, which is like observing the social world, or they use statistical methods. So that the methods are different, but also the interests are different. So we're always interested in how social factors impact the creative process. So for example, like I think I was talking earlier, someone asked earlier about like sort of this question about human nature. And that's not a question sociologists ask so much. Like, we're not just interested in purely like what's going on in your brain, but how what's going on in your brain and your judgments and your decision making is connected to your social world. So how does the market shape your decision making? How does your social interactions with other people influence your decision making? So like, I'm really interested in like this connection between the mind and the social. And one of the things that, I wanted to do in this work is say that sociologists actually don't really look much in artist studios, because they assume that, if someone's alone, they don't really study them sociologically because they're interested in social interaction, but we actually can understand even the moment of being in solitude in a sociological way, because even in that moment of sitting alone and thinking in your studio, you're not an asocial human. You are still impacted by all of these social interactions that you've had in the world, because this frames how you're thinking about creativity, how you're judging your artwork and the decisions that you're making. So you can't ever like escape the social world, even when you're in this moment of solitude. And that's the sort of what I'm interested in understanding. Great. So yeah, this was wonderful. Feel free to raise your hand if there's any last thoughts, or put them in the chat. Okay, I mean, these were really great questions, and I think we're already over time. So, you know, if you want to, I'll put my email in the chat if something comes up, and you want to email me, you can, if you think of any questions that are burning that you didn't get to ask. Otherwise, you know, I'd really love if you could buy my book from Matt and support the bookstore. That would be wonderful. And I really appreciate you all coming to this event. All right. Yeah, I'm going to close out the chat now. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate you being here virtually. Thank you for the applause, the virtual applause. I really appreciate it. So unless there's any last announcements that the Lenox Library wanted to make, I will otherwise, we can otherwise close out the chat now. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.